Welcome to the fourth Sunday of Advent and to Trinity Place. My name is Cameron Miller, and this is a reflection on the readings for Advent. So, Micah was a prophetic oracle of both judgment and hope. And he announced the coming of the destruction of Israel, which would have seemed obvious to anyone not in denial. That's from the reading we had today. But then Micah locates hope for the future in someone who is to come from Bethlehem, which would also have seemed like an obvious choice to his contemporaries. The matriarch Rachel died in Bethlehem, and her grave was a place of pilgrimage. Bethlehem was the setting for the book of Ruth, itself an eloquent oracle of hope. And King David was born in Bethlehem. So it was an auspicious location to posit a future hope. And then Luke, which we heard today, two pregnant women connect and a gusher of hope rushes out like a heart pumping blood. We know that Bethlehem will be brought into that story too. I think this year, heck, the past 2 years or more, might constitute a dark time in which it has been a challenge to have hope. That seems obvious to me, but maybe I'm wrong. Maybe this hasn't been a dark time for you. I knew someone once who made me feel like a real Derek Downer, when most people, I think, would see me as optimistic. I'll come back to that in a moment. But dark times never have clear outcomes. That's part of their darkness. When we can see the light at an end of the tunnel, even if it's just a sparkle, we know we can get through. It's the not knowing, or more particularly the not seeing, that we find so difficult. When we can not tell if something is going to end well or how it might be resolved, and all we know is all the hazards before us, then we feel surrounded by darkness. See, light and dark have to do with what we can see or what we cannot see. So this is a dark time because we cannot see how it all gets resolved. The pandemic, our democracy, the Earth's climate. The stage curtain is closed in front of us. And those big items that fill the atmosphere around us seem to have no visible ending or outcome. So if we want some light, some hope, then staring into that darkness will not deliver it. I'm going to come back to hope, but first I want to go back and tell you about Theoda. Theoda is one of those saints I always try to bring to mind and give thanks for on All Saints' Day. She used to tell people, I was married 3 times and the only husband that lived is one who left me. She was raised by a Seventh-day Adventist minister father, and her growing up was as stern and as harsh as the back of an old-fashioned church pew. She was told she was ugly, and truth be told, she was not beautiful to look at. She was told that she was stupid, but I think she was dumb like a fox. She was called names and given a name that stuck out like a sore thumb, Theoda. Now, I didn't know Theoda until she was well into her 70s when she walked laboriously with a cane. But Theoda was like a cat. You know how you can drop a cat upside down and it always lands on its feet? Theoda was like that. No matter how desperate things looked or how sour the taste of sorrow, she found an upside. She would call, or some would call it naivete, wishful thinking, or even magical thinking and denial. And it might have been all of those and more. But still, Theoda was able to survive and thrive in spite of horrendous pain that might have wiped out somebody else. I knew her when I was just a baby priest, only a couple of years out of the very liberal Episcopal Divinity School in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I was suddenly surrounded by cornfields and preaching and teaching to my fellow Hoosiers who I frequently felt out of step with. So I was aghast every time I drove Theoda somewhere and she prayed for a parking space. And I was infuriated that every time she did that, she got one, or we got one. She took the Bible literally, more or less word for word, whatever it said. She prayed for people and things I would never have the chutzpah to pray for. As far as I know, she never wrestled with God and instead walked through much of her life holding hands with God. Now, there are days that I live that I wish I was more like Theoda, but I'm not. If indeed God has a plan for Cam, then I generally do not recognize it until it's in the rearview mirror and I'm too tired wrestling with it to resist it anymore. The demons and the angels of my nature are more often than not indistinguishable from one another, at least to me. And when I get dropped, unlike the cat, I usually land flat on my back. It was people like Theoda that helped me begin to be curious about prophets like Micah and Isaiah and Jeremiah. At the time, I was much more like the prophet Amos, ferociously pointing out and all the threatening stuff floating around in the darkness with me or with us, and then naming those to blame for our misfortune. The other prophets do that as well, but they also do something else. Micah and Isaiah and Jeremiah are good at drawing lines between current darkness and future hope. They see the hope buried in the moment, and then they name it. They see the hope like a fleck of gold in a gravel sieve, and they point to it. They see the hope when everyone else shouts or cowers or flees the present dangers, and they find safekeeping for it, knowing it will be discovered sooner or later, sometime in the future. While those prophets are good at naming what darkens the moment, they are also good at recognizing and naming the hope of restoration at the other end of the dangers. That's also what I think the Christmas story is, or does for us. You may not remember or care, but I said at the end of last week's sermon that the Christmas story, at its core, is a prophetic story. The Christmas story is surrounded by darkness. Masses of people who have nothing, and I mean nothing, are being pushed and moved around through the arid hill country of Judea and Galilee on a whim of distant imperial bureaucrats moving pins around on a map. People who own enormous resources and who have deadly power to employ against peasants and sharecroppers and shepherds are squeezing even more taxes from already burdened people. While some imagine that they could rebel against the darkness, most of them see no chance for change. Then the census comes along, and everyone knows it's for more control and yet more taxes. Now they will be able to record every name and every property owner and every male heir. There will be no guessing as to how many sheep or goats or donkeys, crops or children you have. They will know. And then there's the slaughter of the innocents in this Christmas story. As God's plague in Egypt did, Herod sought out every male child with orders to slit its throat. It wasn't enough to live with the randomness of death that comes from wild animals or mysterious illness, or suffer rape and robbery from bandits or soldiers. Now it would come to methodical, organized, engineered means by an empire that spoke other languages, wore clothing that was strange and foreign, and with an emperor that they claimed as their god. That and more is in the darkness that surrounds this story about an anonymous infant born homeless in the darkness of night. The story of an infant tearing open its mother's womb, his throat breaking the silence with loud cries from a sudden coldness on his skin, the coo of his mother as he's brought to her breast, the sound of him sucking loudly when he discovers her in his mouth. This is the story of human beings, of a baby and his mother and father surrounded by night and danger and randomness, totally beyond their control. Now we know they make it when thousands of others born that night did not. We know they crawl into the future together as a family until they don't. We know that baby becomes an embodied hope even though his body is cruelly taken from him by the same murderous power that sought him out as an infant. We know that somehow, in spite of randomness, in spite of violence, in spite of brute force, and in spite of thousands of hazards that surround him that night, hazards that eventually took his life, he lives as hope now within our darkness. That baby and who and what he becomes is a veritable constellation of hopeful light texturing any darkness. I think many of the places and people we look to for hope in our present darkness may not shine, but I do think there is light we do not expect to see residing in the Christmas story that we're about to tell. Let's look for and give thanks for that hope next Friday, Christmas Eve, as we gather around and retell that story. On the fourth Sunday of Advent, I wish you well and I wish you peace.